Funny how a single smirk can cost more than $1 million, someone whispered later, but 10 seconds earlier. No one at that table would have believed it. Not in a place like this. Not under the soft golden lights of a Manhattan restaurant where every glass sparkled and every voice stayed just low enough to sound important. Because this was where power dined quietly, and Daniel Whitmore owned the room without even trying. His tailored charcoal suit sitting perfectly on his shoulders, his Swiss watch catching just enough light to remind everyone what time was worth when measured in billions. And across from him, Emily Carter stood with a simple notepad in her hand. Black uniform crisp, posture straight, expression calm in a way that didn't belong to someone who had been on her feet for 8 hours straight. Because most people in her position learned to smile a little wider, speak a little softer, make themselves smaller. But Emily didn't shrink. She simply existed, steady, precise, almost invisible unless you chose to really look. And Daniel didn't look. Not at first. Because men like him didn't need to. They assumed. They categorized. They decided within seconds who mattered and who didn't. And when Emily placed the water glass down a fraction of an inch off center, barely noticeable to anyone else, Daniel saw it. And the corner of his mouth lifted into that quiet, controlled smirk. The kind that never raised his voice but still made the entire table lean toward it. His friends catching the signal, a few soft chuckles following, nothing loud, nothing obvious, just enough to draw a line. Just enough to remind everyone where the hierarchy stood, and Emily noticed. Of course she did, but her expression didn't change, not even slightly. She adjusted the glass with a gentle movement, precise, measured, like she had already accounted for the correction before it was needed. And for a moment, Daniel watched her a little more closely, curious now, because most people reacted, even subtly, a flicker in the eyes, a tighter grip, something, but she gave him nothing. Just quiet efficiency, and that, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, made the smirk linger just a second longer, like he wanted to push it further, to test it. So he leaned back in his chair, glancing at the menu without really reading it, and said, almost casually, "Tell me, do you ever get tired of pretending to understand things you clearly don't?" And the table went still in that polite, anticipatory way people have when they sense a performance about to unfold. Because this was what Daniel did, not cruelty, not exactly, just control, small tests, little moments where he could confirm what he already believed about the world. And Emily stood there, pen resting lightly against her pad, her breathing even, her eyes steady, and for a brief second, something shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space between them, like the air itself paused to listen, and then she spoke, her voice soft, almost gentle. "Sir, would you like me to correct the total on your bill now, or after dessert?" And it was so simple, so calm, that at first no one reacted, because no one understood, not immediately, except Daniel, because he had seen the number earlier, skimmed it without thinking, trusted it without checking, the extra digit tucked neatly into the total, small enough to miss, large enough to matter. And suddenly the smirk faded, not dramatically, not all at once, but like something inside him recalibrated, like the room had shifted just half an inch out of alignment. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore looked directly at Emily Carter, really looked, and realized he had made a mistake. For a moment, Daniel did not move, his fingers still resting lightly against the edge of the table as if the world had paused without asking his permission, and around him, the low hum of conversation seemed to dim just enough for the silence at their table to feel heavier than it should have. Because people like Daniel were not corrected, not in public, not by someone in a black apron holding a notepad, and yet the number was there, clear in his mind now, replaying itself with uncomfortable precision, a subtle addition buried in the total, easy to miss if you trusted without looking, expensive if you did not. And slowly, almost carefully, he reached for the check again, lifting it with a steadiness that felt more deliberate than natural, his eyes scanning the line items one by one. This time not as a man confirming what he already believed, but as someone searching for proof that he had not been mistaken. Except he had been, and the realization settled quietly, not explosive, not dramatic, just undeniable. And across from him, one of his associates shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly as if to break the tension. But no one spoke, because something had changed and they could all feel it, even if they could not yet name it. and Emily remained exactly where she was, not defensive, not triumphant, just present. Her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as though she had simply pointed out the time of day rather than exposing a flaw in a man who built his life on precision. And Daniel exhaled slowly, placing the check back down on the table with a controlled motion, his gaze lifting to meet hers again. But this time, there was no smirk waiting behind it. Only focus, sharp and searching, the kind he reserved for negotiations that mattered. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the casual edge it carried before. "How did you catch that?" And it was not a challenge, not quite. More like a question he had not planned to ask, because the answer mattered in a way he had not expected, and Emily tilted her head just slightly, as if considering how much to say, her eyes flicking briefly to the receipt before returning to him. The subtotal was inconsistent with the item count and tax rate, she said, simple, direct, no embellishment, as though it was obvious, as though anyone paying attention would have seen it, and a faint ripple moved through the table, subtle glances exchanged, because that was not the answer of someone guessing. That was the answer of someone who understood numbers the way Daniel understood leverage, and for a second, something unfamiliar crossed his face, not embarrassment exactly, but recognition, the kind that forced a recalibration, and one of the men beside him gave a short, awkward laugh, trying to recover the atmosphere. "Well, looks like we all missed it," he said, but the humor did not land, because they all knew it was not the same. Missing something was one thing. Being corrected was another, and Daniel straightened slightly in his chair, his shoulders settling into a different kind of posture, less relaxed, more intentional, as if he had stepped into a moment he could not dismiss. And he looked at Emily again, not past her, not through her, but at her, really at her, noticing now the steadiness in her stance, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confidence that did not ask for attention yet held it anyway. And the realization came not as a shock, but as a shift, subtle and irreversible, that whatever he had assumed about her when she first approached the table had been incomplete, and for a man who built empires on reading people correctly, that mattered more than the number on the check. And the room, though still filled with soft voices and clinking glasses, felt different now, as if the balance had tilted just enough that everyone could sense it, even if only one person fully understood why. Daniel did not look away this time, and that alone was enough for the shift to deepen, because men like him were trained to control attention, to give it sparingly, to withdraw at the moment it was no longer useful. But now his focus stayed exactly where it was, anchored on Emily, as if recalculating something far more complex than a number on a receipt. And around the table, his colleagues began to sense that whatever had just happened was not a passing moment, but a fracture in the usual pattern, the kind that forced everyone to adjust whether they wanted to or not. And one of them reached for his glass, taking a sip just to fill the silence, while another glanced down at his phone, pretending to check a message that did not exist, because the atmosphere no longer belonged to casual conversation. It belonged to something quieter, sharper, more deliberate. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat against the table, no longer relaxed, no longer performative, but grounded, present, as if he had stepped out of the role he usually played and into something more honest. And when he spoke again, there was a noticeable absence of the earlier edge, replaced instead by something that sounded almost unfamiliar on him, respect beginning to form but not yet fully shaped. "Most people would not have said anything," he said, not as a compliment, not yet, but as a statement of fact. And Emily's gaze did not waver, her response coming without hesitation. "Most people do not check." And there it was again, not arrogance, not defiance, just clarity, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose, a small exhale that carried more acknowledgement than words would have in that moment, because he understood exactly what she meant, understood that this was not about the receipt, not really. It was about attention, about standards, about the difference between assuming and knowing. And for a brief second, he glanced down at his watch, the polished face reflecting the overhead light, the second hand moving steadily forward, unchanged, unaffected, and yet everything around him felt subtly different, like time had not stopped, but something inside it had shifted. And he straightened in his chair, his decision forming not out of impulse but out of recognition, and slowly, deliberately, he pushed his chair back, the soft scrape against the floor drawing just enough attention from nearby tables to make the moment visible beyond their group, and he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, his posture. Tall, composed, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, he was not the center of the room because of his presence, but because of what he was about to do, and he turned slightly, his voice carrying just enough to reach those closest, clear but not loud. "There is a mistake on this bill," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, "and I missed it." And the admission hung in the air, simple, unadorned, and far heavier than anything he had said earlier, because it was not just about the mistake, it was about ownership. And then, without breaking that calm tone, he continued, his eyes returning to Emily, steady, direct. She did not. And the room, already quiet, seemed to lean into that sentence, as if recognizing that something rare was unfolding, not a spectacle, not a confrontation, but a correction. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who was rarely wrong in public, inclined his head slightly, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just enough to be unmistakable, and said, "I apologize." And it was not forced, not reluctant, but precise, like everything else he valued. And for a moment, no one moved, because the most powerful shift in the room was not the apology itself, but the silence that followed it, a silence filled not with discomfort, but with something closer to respect. And Emily, standing exactly where she had been, did not react the way most would expect. No surprise, no satisfaction, just a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a completed equation. And then she reached for the check, her movements as calm as before, adjusting it with the corrected total, her voice returning to its steady, professional tone. "I will have this updated right away, sir." And as she turned to leave, she did not look back, because she did not need to. The room had already changed, and everyone in it knew exactly why. Emily did not slow down as she walked away, her steps measured, steady, blending back into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant as if nothing unusual had happened, as if a billionaire had not just stood in the middle of a crowded dining room and admitted he was wrong. Because to her, it was not unusual, it was simply correct, and behind her, the table remained still for a second longer than necessary. The kind of stillness that lingers after something real has been said, and Daniel remained standing, his hand resting lightly against the back of his chair, his gaze following her only briefly before he looked down at the table again, not to avoid the moment, but to understand it, to place it somewhere within the framework he used to make sense of the world. And slowly, he sat back down, but the posture was different now, less relaxed, more aware, as if the space he occupied required more attention than before. And one of his associates finally spoke, his voice low, cautious. "Well, that was unexpected." And a few quiet nods followed, but no one laughed this time. No one made light of it, because the tone had shifted in a way that could not be reversed with humor. And Daniel reached for his glass, lifting it halfway before pausing, his eyes drifting toward the direction Emily had gone, not searching for her, but replaying the moment in his mind, every detail, every word, every second that had unfolded faster than he had anticipated. And he realized something that did not sit comfortably. Not because it was unpleasant, but because it was precise. He had not been challenged, he had been corrected. And there was a difference, a significant one. And across the table, another man leaned forward slightly, curiosity edging into his voice. "You think she works in finance or something?" And Daniel shook his head once, almost immediately, not dismissive, but certain. "No," he said quietly, "she pays attention." And the distinction landed heavier than expected, because it was not about credentials, not about titles, but about something far more fundamental, something that could not be bought or assumed. And for a moment, no one responded, because they all understood, even if they did not articulate it. And Daniel set his glass back down without taking a sip, his fingers tapping once lightly against the table before going still again. And then, almost as if the decision had already been made without him realizing it, he signaled subtly toward the floor manager, who approached with professional efficiency, his expression composed but alert, clearly aware that something significant had just occurred. And Daniel spoke in a tone that carried quiet authority, not the commanding kind from earlier, but something more grounded. "The bill needs to be corrected," he said, then paused, just long enough to add, "and I would like her to handle it." And the manager nodded immediately, understanding both the request and the reason behind it, before stepping away. And as the conversation at the table slowly began to resume, it did so differently, softer, more measured, as if everyone was recalibrating their own assumptions in the wake of what they had witnessed. And Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze no longer scanning the room for control, but resting, thoughtful, as if for the first time that evening, he was not trying to dominate the space around him, but to understand it. And somewhere between the clink of silverware and the low murmur of voices, the balance had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that would not easily return to what it had been before. When Emily returned, nothing about her suggested that anything had changed, not her pace, not her posture, not even the way she held the updated check between her fingers with quiet precision, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, and this was no different. And in many ways, it was not, because for her, accuracy was not an exception, it was a baseline. And as she approached the table, the subtle shift in attention was immediate, not loud, not obvious, but present, the kind of awareness that follows someone who has already altered the tone of a room without raising their voice. And Daniel noticed it too, not with surprise, but with recognition, because influence did not always come from power. Sometimes it came from clarity. And as she placed the corrected bill gently in front of him, her movements were the same as before, controlled, efficient, deliberate, but now he was watching differently, not assessing, not testing, simply observing. And she spoke in that same steady tone. "The total has been adjusted, sir." And there was no emphasis, no suggestion that the moment carried weight, because she did not need to point to what had already happened. And Daniel nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, his hand moving toward the check, but pausing just before touching it, his eyes lifting to meet hers again. And this time there was no distance in the look, no quiet assumption behind it, only focus, and perhaps something closer to respect than he was used to expressing. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke. The silence not awkward, not tense, but complete, as if the conversation had already happened in everything that was not said. And then Daniel reached for the check, reviewing it once more, not because he doubted it, but because he understood now that attention was not optional, it was essential. And across the table, his associates had grown noticeably quieter, their earlier confidence replaced with a more careful awareness, as if they too were recalibrating their understanding of the moment. And one of them leaned back slightly, watching Emily with a different kind of interest, not dismissive, not casual, but attentive, because whatever assumptions had existed before no longer applied in the same way. And Daniel set the check down again, this time with certainty, his fingers resting briefly on the edge before he spoke, his voice measured, intentional. "Thank you." And it was simple, almost understated, but the tone carried something it had not before, acknowledgement without condition. And Emily inclined her head slightly in response, not as a gesture of submission, but as a recognition of closure, because for her, the interaction had reached its natural end, and she turned to leave, her steps as steady as when she arrived, moving seamlessly back into the flow of the restaurant, where other tables needed attention, other orders needed precision, and behind her, Daniel remained still for a moment longer, his gaze following her just enough to register the absence she left behind, not an absence of service, but an absence of assumption. And he leaned back slowly in his chair, his shoulders settling as if releasing something unspoken, and one of his associates finally broke the quiet, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than before. "You do not see that every day." And Daniel did not respond immediately, his eyes drifting once more to the polished face of his watch, the second hand continuing its steady motion. Unchanged, reliable. But for the first time that evening, he was not measuring time. He was measuring something else entirely, something less tangible but far more precise. And after a brief pause, he said quietly, almost to himself, "No, you do not." And the words carried not just agreement, but recognition, the kind that lingers long after the moment itself has passed. The conversation at the table resumed, but it no longer carried the same rhythm, the laughter softer, the pauses longer, as if everyone present had become slightly more aware of the space between words, and Daniel noticed it without looking directly at anyone. The way a man notices a change in temperature without needing to check the thermostat. And he let the moment settle instead of trying to steer it back to what it had been. Because something in him had shifted as well, not dramatically. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, internal recalibration that he could not ignore, and he reached for his glass again. This time actually taking a sip, the cool water grounding, familiar, but even that simple act felt more deliberate than before, as if he was moving with intention rather than habit. And across from him, one of his associates leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation contained. "You really meant that apology," he said. Not as a question, but as an observation, and Daniel's gaze flicked toward him briefly before returning to the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass. And for a moment, he did not answer, not because he was avoiding it, but because he was choosing the words more carefully than he usually did. And when he spoke, it was quiet, almost reflective. "Precision matters," he said. And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything longer would have, because it was not about the bill anymore, not about the mistake, but about something broader, something that extended beyond the table, beyond the restaurant, into the way he approached everything. And the man across from him nodded slowly, understanding more than the words themselves, and the conversation shifted again, not back to its original tone, but forward into something more measured, more thoughtful, as if the entire group had adjusted to a new standard without needing to acknowledge it directly. And a few minutes passed like that, subtle, steady, until Daniel's attention drifted once more, not to his phone, not to the room, but to the movement of the staff. And there, across the dining area, Emily moved between tables with the same quiet efficiency, her presence consistent, unaffected, as if she had not left any imprint behind at all, and that, more than anything, held his focus. Because influence that did not seek recognition was the rarest kind. And he watched for a moment, longer than necessary, noting the way she listened before speaking, the way she adjusted small details without drawing attention to them, the way she maintained a standard that did not depend on who was sitting at the table. And something about that stood out in a way that was difficult to ignore, because it was not reactive, it was inherent. And Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in thought, as if he was looking at a pattern he had not considered before. And then, almost without realizing it, he spoke again, this time not to the group, but more to the moment itself. She did not change when the situation did, and one of the men glanced at him, following his line of sight toward Emily. "You mean she stayed calm?" he said, but Daniel shook his head once, subtle, precise. "No," he replied, "she stayed consistent." And the distinction settled quietly between them, because calm could be temporary, a response to pressure, but consistency was something else entirely, something that did not depend on the environment. And for a brief second, the table fell into that familiar silence again, not uncomfortable, not forced, but thoughtful, as if each person was measuring that idea against their own understanding. And Daniel's gaze lingered for one last moment before he looked away, not dismissing her, but acknowledging something he did not need to observe further. And as the evening continued, the conversations gradually found their rhythm again. But it was not the same rhythm they had started with. It was quieter, more deliberate, shaped by something that had not raised its voice but had still managed to redefine the space it occupied. And somewhere between the steady ticking of his watch and the soft movement of the room, Daniel Whitmore understood that what had happened was not a disruption, it was a correction. And corrections, when they were real, did not fade, they stayed. Time moved forward, but the shift did not fade. It settled, embedding itself into the quiet rhythm of the evening like something that had always belonged there. And Daniel felt it in the way his attention no longer drifted aimlessly, in the way each small detail now seemed to carry weight where before it had been dismissed. And he found himself noticing things he would have ignored just an hour earlier. The precise alignment of silverware on nearby tables, the subtle timing between courses, the way conversations rose and fell like a controlled current rather than random noise. And it occurred to him that none of it was accidental, that someone was always paying attention, always maintaining a standard that most people never saw. And his gaze returned, almost instinctively. To Emily, who was now across the room, listening to a customer with the same calm focus she had shown him, her posture unchanged, her tone steady, her presence consistent in a way that did not demand recognition but quietly earned it. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers interlacing for a moment as if holding a thought in place. And then he spoke, not loudly, not to command attention, but in a way that drew it anyway. "Do you know what most people miss?" he asked, his eyes still directed toward the far side of the room, and one of his associates glanced up, following his line of sight. "What?" he replied, and Daniel paused, just long enough to make the answer. "Land with intention. They think moments like that are rare," he said, his voice even, measured. "But they are not. They just do not notice them." And the words hung in the air, quiet but precise, and the man across from him frowned slightly, considering it. "You mean people like her?" he asked, and Daniel shook his head once, subtle, controlled. "No," he said. "I mean the standard she holds." And that distinction settled deeper, because it was not about the individual, not about talent alone, but about something repeatable, something deliberate. And for a moment, no one responded, because they were not used to hearing Daniel speak this way, not in observations, not in reflections, but in something closer to understanding, and he leaned back again. His posture relaxed but not careless, as if he had adjusted to a different balance, and one of the men let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh but without humor. "You are analyzing a waitress," he said, half amused, half uncertain, and Daniel turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze, not defensive, not sharp, just clear. "No," he replied. "I am recognizing discipline." And the word carried more weight than anything else he had said that evening, because discipline was something he understood, something he valued, something he built his entire life around. And to see it in a place he had not expected, in a form he had overlooked, forced a recalibration he could not ignore. And across the room, Emily finished with her table and moved on without hesitation, her pace unchanging, her focus uninterrupted, and Daniel watched just long enough to confirm what he already knew, that her consistency was not situational, it was foundational. And he looked back at the table, his decision forming, not out of impulse, but out of alignment, as if something had finally clicked into place. And he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small card, placing it on the table in front of him without comment, his fingers resting on it for a second before lifting away. And the gesture was quiet, almost insignificant to anyone not paying attention. But for Daniel, it marked a shift from observation to action, and the room continued around them, unaware that something had just been set in motion. Something that did not need an announcement, did not require validation, because the most important changes rarely did. And as the second hand of his watch moved forward, steady, precise, Daniel Whitmore understood that what he had witnessed was not a moment to admire. It was a standard to follow, and standards, once seen clearly, had a way of changing everything that came after. The card remained on the table for a few seconds before anyone acknowledged it. A small rectangle of matte black against polished wood, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, and Daniel did not draw attention to it, did not explain it, because for him, decisions did not require commentary, they required clarity, and he had already reached that point. And across from him, one of the men finally leaned forward slightly, his curiosity overcoming restraint. "You are not serious," he said, quietly, glancing between Daniel and the card. And Daniel did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, his posture relaxed but intentional, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the question was asked. And then, without shifting tone, he replied, "I am always serious when I recognize value." And the words settled with a weight that silenced any immediate response, because they understood what that meant, understood that Daniel Whitmore did not make gestures without purpose. And yet, this did not feel like one of his usual calculated moves. It felt quieter, more grounded, as if it came from observation rather than strategy. And a few seconds later, Emily approached the table again, not because she had been called, but because it was part of her sequence, her system, checking in at the right moment, maintaining the flow without interruption. And when she reached them, nothing in her expression suggested expectation, nothing hinted that she anticipated anything beyond routine. And Daniel noticed that too. the absence of anticipation, the absence of self-positioning, and it confirmed what he had already concluded, and he reached forward, picking up the card between his fingers, holding it for a brief second before placing it gently beside the check, aligned with the same precision she had shown earlier, and then he looked up at her, not with authority, not with assumption, but with clarity. "When your shift ends," he said, his voice even, controlled, "I would like you to consider a conversation." And he did not elaborate, did not sell the idea, because he understood that anything he added would reduce the weight of what had already been said. And Emily's eyes moved briefly to the card, then back to him, her expression unchanged, but there was a pause, a small one, just enough to acknowledge that this was not part of the usual pattern, and for a moment, the space between them held that pause, not tense, not uncertain, just open, and then she spoke, her tone as steady as before. "I appreciate the offer," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, respectful but not yielding. "But I do not make decisions during a shift." And the response landed with quiet precision, because it did not reject, did not accept. It simply set a boundary, clear, unambiguous. And Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, and then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, not surprised, not challenged, but acknowledging the standard she had just reinforced. "Fair," he said, a single word, measured, aligned with the moment, and Emily inclined her head slightly in return, the exchange complete without needing anything more, and she stepped back, turning to continue her work without looking at the card again, without revisiting the offer, because for her, the present moment still required her full attention, and as she moved away, one of the men at the table exhaled quietly, almost in disbelief. "She did not even hesitate," he said, and Daniel leaned back slowly, his eyes following her for a brief second before returning to the table. "No," he replied, his voice calm, certain. "She did not." And there was no frustration in the statement, no irritation, only recognition, because what she had just done was not refusal, it was consistency, the same consistency that had corrected him, the same consistency that did not bend for status or opportunity. And as the card remained untouched on the table, its presence now carrying more meaning than before, Daniel Whitmore understood that the conversation he had proposed had already begun, not in words, but in standards, and standards, when they were real, did not compete, they revealed. The evening drew toward its natural close, not with a dramatic shift, but with a quiet unwinding, the kind that happens when a room slowly returns to its baseline after something meaningful has passed through it. And Daniel sat back in his chair, the untouched card still resting beside the check, no longer an offer waiting to be accepted, but a marker of something already understood and around him. The conversation had softened into something lighter, yet no one had fully returned to the way they had started, because once a standard is seen clearly, it becomes difficult to ignore it again, and Daniel glanced once more across the room, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging. And there she was, Emily Carter, moving through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady rhythm, her attention undivided, her pace unchanged, as if the entire evening had been nothing more than another sequence completed with care. And he watched for a moment, long enough to confirm what he already knew, that nothing about her presence depended on who was watching, and that realization settled with a kind of clarity that did not need further analysis. And he reached for the check, signing it with a smooth, practiced motion, the pen gliding across the paper without hesitation. But this time, before setting it down, he paused, his eyes resting briefly on the corrected total, not to verify it, but to acknowledge the moment that had led there. And then he placed the pen beside it, aligned, deliberate, and stood, adjusting his jacket with a subtle movement that signaled the end of the evening, and one by one, the others followed, chairs sliding back, voices lowering, the group preparing to leave. But as Daniel stepped away from the table, he did not take the card with him. He left it exactly where it was, beside the check, untouched, unclaimed, because some invitations were not meant to be insisted upon. They were meant to exist as they were, complete in their intention, and as they moved toward the exit, the restaurant continued around them, unchanged in appearance, but different in a way that could not be seen, only felt. And just before he reached the door, Daniel slowed, not stopping completely, just enough to glance back one final time, and Emily was there again, near another table, listening, adjusting, maintaining that same quiet standard without interruption, and for a brief second, their eyes did not meet, and that was the point, because recognition did not require acknowledgement, and he turned, stepping out into the cool Manhattan night, the city lights reflecting off glass and steel, the familiar world waiting exactly as he had left it. And yet, something in him had shifted, not in a way that would be announced, not in a way that demanded change, but in a way that would quietly influence every decision that followed. And behind him, inside the restaurant, Emily would eventually return to the table, clear it with the same precision, and find the card resting beside the signed check. And whether she chose to pick it up or leave it there would not define the moment, because the moment had already done its work. It had corrected something that did not need to be spoken again. And as the door closed softly behind him, Daniel Whitmore understood a truth that no amount of money could accelerate, that respect is not commanded by presence, it is earned in silence. And once it is recognized, it does not ask to be remembered, it simply changes the way you see everything that comes after.